Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Good afternoon, Dan Proft, and joining me on this edition of Illinois Rising is the co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project, Pat Hughes. Pat, thanks so much for joining us.
Dan, thanks for having me back on the program.
So this week we had the Chicago Teachers Union hold a mock strike vote, which is kind of a pro forma exercise. When Chicago teachers went out on strike a couple years back, they did so with north of 90% of support from the city's 30,000 teachers. This is a little bit of kind of the run-up to a possible work stoppage right after the first of the year, according to Karen Lewis, the union president of CTU. We talked to Karen Lewis earlier in the week on the Morning Answer program I co-host with Amy Jacobson, and she seemed pretty serious about the possibility of a strike if they can't reach agreement with the Chicago public school system. And it seems like part of that agreement, or even the potential to reach an agreement, is for the state to come in yet again and provide, according to Forrest Claypool, the CEO of CPS, some $500 million in additional state funding for the Chicago public schools.
Yeah, Dan, and this is what's going to happen every time that Karen Lewis and CTU don't feel that they're going to get their way. What Rahm Emanuel should have done back in 2012 was, hold her feet to the fire, let her strike, and try to break the stranglehold that she has on her membership and, frankly, that they have on the students of CPS. So this doesn't surprise me at all. This is standard operating procedure. When Karen Lewis and her cronies don't get their way, they threaten to strike and put the children at risk. By the way, they're already tremendously at risk, even if they're going to school.
Yeah, but I would say one other thing. It's not Karen Lewis and CTO alone. Forrest Claypool and Rahm, Tiny Dancer, as I have popularized his name, they are wearing black hats, too. They are running to Springfield. At least Karen Lewis is honest. Karen Lewis, when we talked to her, look, it's not just a Springfield bailout. Here's what the city should do to generate more revenue, increase taxes, long-term for the schools. I'm for a LaSalle Street financial transaction tax. I'm for a progressive state income tax. I'm open to the possibility, she said, of imposing a city income tax, a new tax, in addition to the transaction tax. So Karen Lewis is willing to tax everything that moves in order to subsidize CPS, and that's an honest position. Tiny Dancer and Forrest Claypool pretend like they're reformers while doing some facsimile of what Karen Lewis advocates.
Yeah, and they did it the last time around. Rahm Emanuel did it. Obviously, Claypool wasn't around for that. But what those guys need to do, and hopefully they will, I doubt that they will, is to just stand up to her instead of using her as sort of a cudgel against Governor Rauner to see if they can get the state to break its budget impasse and fund them, is to call her out, see if she's going to go forward with it. Someone needs to push back, Dan, on the fact that no one at CPS is actually getting educated. And we hear about taxing and dollars and financing and the teachers' benefits and whatever. And Karen Lewis always says, well, it's about the children. Someone needs to message out, and it should be a manual, and he can't because it'll make him look bad, that the schools are failing.
It's not about the children for Tiny Dancer either. This is all about control of the system. These are central planners arguing over who gets to be the preeminent central planner. But in terms of the quality of education at CPS and how this may be illustrative of what's going on in major urban centers with respect to their school systems nationally, we're now joined by Kyle Olson. Kyle Olson is the founder and CEO of Education Action Group and has a great website, eagnews.org, that I read regularly for education news from around the country, including on Chicago. They do a better job sometimes of covering the Chicago public school system than does Chicago media. Kyle, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I got to relate to you this conversation I had with Karen Lewis earlier in the week, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union, because we talked about some of the data that was included in a piece that was on your site this week about 30% of Chicago fourth graders proficient in math and only 25% of eighth graders proficient in math. Fourth grade reading, 27% proficient. 24% of eighth graders proficient, according to NAEP test, National Assessment of Educational Progress test. Karen Lewis's response to that was to argue with me about the definition of proficient. Proficient in Karen Lewis's dictionary means expert, but it doesn't mean that a substantial portion of the other 70% of non-proficient fourth graders and eighth graders in CPS are not doing satisfactorily when it comes to reading and math scores. How do you respond to that little discussion about definitions?
Well, I mean, you know, they will twist numbers and stats and all of that, and test scores and all of that to fit their narrative. But the bottom line is, you can look at test scores, you can look at graduation rates, you can look at all of those sorts of things and show that the government education system is not working for many, many kids. I mean, we have a story coming out next week where in Buffalo Public Schools, it's in the teachers' union contract that taxpayers will pay for plastic surgeries for unionized employees. In this past school year, in one school year, taxpayers spent $5 million. And so what we do is we contrast that with student achievement data, which shows 13% of students were proficient in math, 12% of students were proficient in reading. And yet the school district is spending $25,000 per student to get those results. And so people like Karen Lewis, they don't want to talk about the results. All they want to focus on is what is going into the system and how, in their opinion, there is not enough going into the system, instead of what we should be focusing on, and that is what is coming out of the system.
Hey, Kyle, it's Pat Hughes. Thanks so much for joining us. And you mentioned Buffalo, and obviously we have our problems here in the state of Illinois and with CPS. I'm actually a product of CPS schools from the late 1970s when things, I think, were a little better, although we had strikes from time to time back then as well. What is the problem? It seems like it should be very easy to message the fact that there is no proficiency, that more money is getting spent on public education. Certainly that's the case here at CTU every single year, and there's no results for that. It should be an easy message. It should be easy to get the parents rallied around that message. Why is it so easy for someone like Karen Lewis or Rahm Emanuel to deflect those statistics that are so terrible for the students?
Because, I mean, they have the narrative. Everyone, I think when you look at polling, people believe teachers. And so when a teacher says something, or when a union president like Karen Lewis says something, people tend to believe it. But yet you don't really have people on the other side in that sort of, you know, at that sort of level, whether it's a mayor or somebody like that, saying, you know, this course that we're on is not sustainable. And that's I think the other issue here too, is that you know, you look at, and I know you guys talk about the pension problem, and you look at all of these other problems that are plaguing CPS and the state in general, and this system, or the course that they're on, is not sustainable. But Karen Lewis and the others, they don't want to focus on the solutions, because the solutions involve them giving up pay, giving up benefits, giving up sick days, all of those sorts of things, and they don't want to focus on that.
And just another interesting story that was on your website, eagnews.org, this week, in terms of, you know, their guy and getting more state and federal funding. President Obama, his administration, vowing to send $70 million to Pakistan to educate a couple 100,000 female students between the ages of 10 and 19. Well, if the urban school systems in all these Democrat-controlled big cities like Chicago, if they are in such financial dire straits and need an infusion of cash, maybe they should ask President Obama why he's sending $70 million to Pakistan instead of sending it to Chicago.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's crazy to me to see where we're throwing money. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that money should go to CPS or somewhere, because as we know, it will just disappear, and there won't be anything to show for it. But it boggles my mind that we can focus on Pakistan and on other countries and trying to boost opportunities for people there, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, but when we have concrete evidence across the country, I mean, it's not like CPS is the only school system that's failing. Detroit, Buffalo, across the country, we have school systems that are failing, and they continue to get more money, and they don't turn out the results that people should expect. And so I can't figure it out why so many parents just allow this sort of thing to happen and tolerate it.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're essentially making the rank order of priority argument, which is a good argument. Kyle Olson, the founder and CEO of Education Action Group. As I mentioned, the website you should check out routinely, eagnews.org. Kyle, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Happy to.